יופי. Morning, Judy. Can't hear you.
בוקר טוב.
יפה.
אני מבין שגם אביך פה, אז גם הוא יכול להתייחס.
הוא יכול בהחלט, כן.
כן, אז הוא יותר מוסמך ממני לדבר על חלק גדול מהנושאים האלה.
הוא היה, הנה הוא וגם אמא שלי, הוא היה לפני שנה, האירוע יום העצמאות שלנו היה, הוא היה האורח,
אוקיי.
והוא ענה בדיוק על שאלות כאלה.
אוקיי, היי דוד, היי. טוב, אז אני עכשיו קצת חושש שאני לא אבייש אותך, ושאני לא אגיד דברים שאתה תצטרך לסתור.
אל תדאג.
Morning, Sensi. Nice to see you.
Good to be here. I watched the film half yesterday and half this morning, so I'm really got it in my system.
Yeah. It gets under your skin, that one, that movie. Good morning, Diane Sasson.
Good morning, Rabbi. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I see David and Eileen somewhere in there.
They're here too. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Maya. How are you?
Good. Nice to be here. Nice to see everybody.
Yeah. Hey, Adam. Oh, he's still connecting there. Good morning, everybody, and good evening to the Israel folks. Got a few of them. We'll give another few minutes for people to gather. Boker tov, Amy. Shalom. Boker tov, Adam.
בוקר טוב.
Adam, are you in the Midwest or are you back here? We can't hear you.
You're right. You can't. I came back a couple of days ago. I'm still a little wiped out, but holding my own.
All right. Good trip. You got the movie shot.
After another 20 trips, I'll have the movie shot. But it was a good beginning.
Okay.
It was 20 degrees and snowing in the north of Wisconsin, and I was on a farm and freezing the entire time, and I'm still trying to warm up 5 days later, I think.
Uh-oh.
But it was good.
What's your film about?
Hard to say. It's about different Catholic individuals and communities dealing with climate change. Both on farms, did a lot about the land. It's about people dealing with the land. It's about nuns turning over their land to indigenous peoples.
Wow.
About the Pope. Pope is a great environmentalist, so there's a lot in there.
Sounds like some rays of hope.
We all look for rays of hope where we can. Somebody said to me once, "You work at hope. If you do things, you create hope in your life." So, something like that.
That's very. We're here to talk about Israel, whose national anthem is the Hope, and that's exactly what we're working on today, in a way. Seeing if
I thought I'd give you a throw, Misha.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. That's helpful.
Whoever's providing the birds chirping, I appreciate that as an element of hope as well.
I think that's me. I'm outside.
Beautiful. Thank you. To us urbanites, we thank you.
Is it bothering anyone? Should I go inside?
Well, why don't you let us hear the birds for another little bit, and then when we start in a couple minutes, so you can mute your. We'll ask anyways. We'll ask people to mute. So
Okie doke.
let's keep some chirping. So we had our first Kumah event on Thursday night, which was quite fabulous. Some of you, I think, were there on Zoom, and some of you were there in person. But it was an exciting thing. We were in Giora Aharoni, this artist's studio, artist and architect, and it happened to be Yom HaShoah, and he spoke some things about that and his relationship with Yom HaShoah and the relationship between that, and he showed us this one piece of his about essentially showing the Jews crossing the Red Sea and how he got to that during the Syrian refugee crisis, and that's what it was about for him, and that was that was an important part of the opening of this festival. Actually, it was interesting to kind of get that take on, Adam spoke about hope. You have to work on hope. So these holidays like Yom HaShoah, these Memorial Days, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron is Memorial Day, and Yom HaAtzmaut, they can be back-looking days, or they can be forward-looking days, or they could be now-looking days. And Giora pointed us in that direction of let's look at what's going on right now. That's, I think, kind of how we got to this particular event. I was just riffing there. I didn't really mean to start my introduction, but it seems like I have. So I think maybe we'll just kind of dive in. Let's see. Do we have? It's 11:06. Why don't we kick off our little gathering here? So welcome. Welcome. There's a few faces I haven't said hi to. Hi, Audrey. Hi, Susan. Hi, Lillian. Hi, Ilana. Hi, other Susan. Hi, all the people with their cameras off. It's wonderful to be with you all today at our second event of the Kumah Festival this year. And this is the event that's going to deal with the state of Israel, because we're in the midst of this week, which began on Thursday with Independence Day, Yom HaAtzmaut, and Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and will conclude this week, towards the end of this week, with Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. And it is a time in which it's a contemplative moment in the Jewish calendar about what's happening right now, about the state of the world, and the state of the Jewish state, and the state of our relationship with the Jewish state. And so every year on Yom HaAtzmaut, I have these conflicting feelings about what I'm supposed to bring to the community, and to what we're supposed to be dealing with, because a lot of people have the instinct that they want to celebrate, and they no matter what is happening over there, they still feel like Israel is a miracle, and that it's wonderful that it exists. And I think most of us have good feelings about Israel, and at the same time, I think most of us also carry very difficult, trying feelings about this place. And so it's always a conundrum. How are we supposed to both celebrate and be real about what's going on over there? And this year, what we decided to do was to watch a film. Adam and Amy helped me choose this film, and I thank you for that, both of you. And Adam and Amy are here. They're both documentary filmmakers as well as a bunch of other things, and they helped me choose this film, The Law in These Parts, which I hope you've all seen. And if you haven't yet seen it or seen all of it, then I think you still have a day or two to watch that, to click on that link and watch it. But here's where I want to go with the state of this before I introduce David, our honored guest. I'll give a short introduction about that's inspired really by David. I'm sorry. Thank you. Adam is reminding me that I said Adam and Amy, but Amy is Adam's wife, and Maya is the other filmmaker. Thank you, Adam. So Maya and Adam helped me, and Maya in particular chose this film. David Kretzmer is he has told me at one point when we were hanging out at his son Yoni's house in Brooklyn. Yoni is a dear friend of mine and a saxophone player and a teacher that I've been working with for a long time and a cantor. And I found out there that David's favorite way of studying Torah is Gemara, is Talmud. So I thought it's appropriate that I'll conjure a line from the Gemara, from the Talmud, to open us up here today. Okay, so in the first tractate of the Talmud, Brachot, it talks about dreams, and it says the following. It says, and dreams, of course, right? You think back to Herzl. Herzl said, what is it? It is no. If you will it, it is no dream. Im tirtzu ein zo agada. Yeah. So dreams and nightmares, perhaps, are a big part of our psyche with regards to the state of Israel, I would say. So here's what it says. One of the many things it says. It says, "En mar'in lo la'adam ela mehirhurei libo." A person is not shown in a dream anything but the musings or thinking of his heart or her heart. Yeah, whatever's happening in our heart, whatever thoughts are going on in our heart, that's what's gonna appear in our dreams in some way. Yeah, this is one of the attitudes about this dream. Yeah, so when I'm there in my confusion about what we're supposed to do this Yom HaAtzmaut, I'm thinking we all have this overflowing of complexity in our hearts around the state of Israel. And there are certain pieces that we feel like we know, and there are certain pieces that we feel like we don't know very well. And one of those pieces that I think many of us don't know as well are the legal system. And what actually is, how do things actually function there legally in the West Bank, right? We know there's this system set up. We know there's an occupation. We know all these, we know there's all kinds of contested feelings and contested ideas with regards to it. But what are some of the nuts and bolts of this system? And that's how I made sense of Maya's suggestion that we watch this movie, The Law in These Parts. And also, I would say, as a celebration of, Israel has a way of producing truly extraordinary people. really probably the most extraordinary people, or many of the really outlandishly extraordinary people that I know in my life that I've met are Israelis. There's something about that place that manages to produce incredible people. Ra'anan Alexandrovich, who created this film, is one of those people, and David Kretzmer, who's our guest today, is another one of these people. Extraordinary people. So that's another way we could say we're celebrating Israel, because it manages somehow to produce truly amazing people, amazing individuals. And I'm sure, when you saw that film, you saw that it was incredibly, it gave a lot of information that we didn't know. It challenged us, and there was a true artfulness. There's a true artfulness to the way he creates the feeling in that movie of being judged, and of a person's lack of control over what's going to happen to them in their lives in this circumstance. And he puts us in that position and keeps telling us, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'm gonna show you certain pieces, and I'm in charge of what you see and what you don't see during these next 90 minutes or so. And that's this, and then we hear about it when the people are when they're on trial. We hear that many of these people never even got to know what they're charged with, because it was information that was kept with the Shabak, with the security service. And so there's a lot of pieces of it that we don't get to see. And then at the very end of the movie, he puts all of these judges who we've met over the course of the film, besafsal hane'eshamim, in the seat of the accused, for us, all of us, to judge them based on the limited information that we received. Right? So there's a true artiness to the way he's bringing in the artistic component there, the political component of what he's showing us. And for all of us, especially in the Kumah festival, when we're dealing with connecting faith, art, and politics, we're here in large part out of our faith world. And our faith world is a crucial component. Our Jewish identities, these are a crucial component of why we are here today. So those three elements, I think, come together in a powerful way in this movie and in the experience of watching this film. Before I introduce David, I want to invite us all to count the Omer, which I think if any of you are like me and are delinquent in the daily counting of the Omer, I think this is a good opportunity to do it. The Omer is the counting of the days between Passover and Shavuot, in which we are preparing ourselves to receive the Torah. So we'll do that. Then I'll introduce David, and then we'll get into a conversation. Yeah, because what is that? What does that mean, receiving the Torah, if not really getting into our dreams and our truth and what we know and don't know? So here we go. You guys can say the at least the beginning of the blessing with me. Sorry, before that we say Hineni muchan umezuman lekayem mitzvat aseh shel sfirat haomer. I am ready and prepared to complete the positive commandment of counting the Omer. And then you guys can say the beginning of the blessing with me. It starts like all the other blessings. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat haomer. The last three words are al sfirat haomer. And we count hayom 15 yom shehem shte shavuot v'yom echad la'omer. Today are 2 weeks and 15 days, which are 2 weeks and 1 day to the Omer. So David Kretzmer, thank you so much for being with us today. Toda rabba she'ata po. David, as I said, I met David. I first got to know David as the son of Yoni and the father of Yoni and the father-in-law of Avital, two of my dear friends and colleagues. But quickly, I learned more about him. Some through my father, who they know each other from Hebrew University and their work for many years, as well as through some of their political work. David worked with some of these justices that we met in the film after law school. He had a big part in this particular film, actually. As far as I understand, what his son tells me is that long quote that you saw at the end, where Meir Shamgar, the former head of the Supreme Court of Justice, they read to him a quote by a legal scholar that has a very pointed and difficult question raised there. And it upsets him greatly when he hears this quote. He doesn't like it much at all. That quote is a direct quote from Professor Kretzmer's writing. So he is one of the major legal minds in Israel, which, with regards to these particular ideas of human rights and civil rights. He's one of the founders of several of the most important civil and human rights organizations in Israel. He had a hand in creating ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, which whenever a case gets all the way to the New York Times, it's very often the plaintiff is the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, ACRI, who are suing for some breach of justice. The Center for Human Rights is another one of the places that he's had a major hand in creating. B'Tselem, which I hope at least some of you know, it's another major human rights organization. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that Professor Kretzmer has a big hand in creating the infrastructure to support a human rights, civil rights centered approach in Israel and Palestine. It's in large part. He played a major part in that. And I'm very, very excited to have him here with us today. David, I thought I would open with one question that is a kind of legal question that came up in the film early on in the film. And I'll ask some questions, and then we'll kind of open it up for people to ask some other questions. We might pause at some point also to see a short clip from the film. So one of the questions that comes up in general there, and I think about this in regards to the American legal system as well, is the question of the purpose of the legal system in general. What is the purpose of this legal system in the occupied territories? And by extension, to me, it brings up the question: what is the purpose of any legal system? And one of those people who was a military judge and spent years on the court there, he says it very clearly that what they were working on, it was not justice, right? We call it the Supreme Court of Justice, but it was not justice. It's what he calls seder, order. And so that's the question that I wanted to pose to you is, what actually, how do you see the purpose of any legal system? And is there a difference between the purpose of the legal system in the West Bank and in the occupied territories than any other legal system, say, here in the United States?
Well, thank you, first of all, for that very kind introduction, Misha, after all the kind things that you said about me, which I ask everybody to take with more than a grain of salt, I'm very reluctant to even answer your questions. The general thing that my father used to say is better keep your mouth shut and let people think you're a fool than open your mouth and confirm it. But anyhow, I'm going to confirm it. And I'll try to relate to your question, but I think it's very important, first of all, to say something about the whole notion of occupation, because only if we understand what the notion of occupation is about, can we then answer the question of, well, what kind of a legal system are we going to have in a system of occupation? And is it going to be different from a legal system in a country like the United States, which for the moment at least is partly democratic? I'm not very optimistic about what will happen in the next few years, but let's say for the moment. The law of war and the law of occupation is part of the law of war. The law of war does not attempt to create some ideal system. It is a system of law which comes to terms with reality, with the reality of war. War is not something we want. To start a war, unless it's a war of self-defense, is now outlawed by international law. And yet we have to recognize the fact that there are going to be wars. And in that situation, we have a dilemma. What are we going to do? Are we going to say, because it's a situation which we don't like and which is intolerable and which should be stopped, we're not going to have any legal rules? Or we're going to say, well, let's at least have some kind of legal rules so that there will not be utter chaos. And the international community, beginning fairly early on, but developing in the 19th century, took the second approach. And the law of occupation is part of the law of war, because occupation is a function of law. And like the other parts of the law of war, the law of occupation has to deal with the reality. And what is that reality? The reality is that we have some territory which was being ruled before the war by one country. Another country now captures that territory, and the previous country is no longer capable of fulfilling the major task of any country, and that is to have law and order in the territory over which it has jurisdiction and control. And so the law of occupation says, well, we cannot allow chaos. And this just on the film itself, that's what Colonel Sheffy says. We cannot allow chaos. And therefore, because the army of occupation is responsible for the present situation, whether lawfully or unlawfully, it doesn't matter, but they're responsible for the fact that the previous government can no longer carry out its major functions, we are going to place the duty on the occupying power to fulfill the major functions of government on a temporary basis. Not because it has legitimacy, not because it represents the people in the territory, only because it, as a result of force, is the only actual force in the area which can carry out the major functions of government, and that is to protect public order and to facilitate civil life, that people can go on living their lives, they can make contracts, they can buy and sell property, they can buy food, they can sell food, they can look after their health. These laws also developed at the end of the 19th century, when the concept of government was a concept of laissez-faire government. The government had negative duties. Its main duty was law and order. It wasn't a government which had positive duties towards the population. So that is fundamentally the law of war, and it was already enshrined in the Hague Convention of 1907, and which says that once the army has taken over control of the territory, it has actual control over the territory, it has the duty to restore and maintain public order and facilitate public life. That is the fundamental duty of the law of occupation. Now, the assumptions of the law of occupation, the political assumptions of the law of occupation, is that it's going to be a short and temporary situation. We've had a war. The occupation is a function of the war, And now we have to turn to peace, and we hope to have negotiations. And during those negotiations, the territory will probably be returned to its lawful sovereign or to the people in the territory. The occupation will end, and that will be the end of that. But the law of occupation cannot lay down a period of occupation. It just has the assumption of temporality. And the assumption of temporality means that the occupying powers are very much restricted. It cannot affect major changes in the territory. It's supposed to respect the law in force in the territory at the time that it occupies the territory, and not to make major political changes in the area. Now let's go to the Israeli occupation, because this is what we want to speak about now. It's very interesting that when Israel occupied the territories in 1967, and you saw that in the film, they'd already prepared in advance for the situation that the Israeli army may take over a territory which was not in the hands of the state of Israel. This was a result of the fiasco of the 1956 occupation of the Gaza Strip, which Israel occupied and didn't have a clue what to do about it. There was no existing law or legal structure. They didn't know what to do. And the man who then became the Advocate General of the Israeli army and subsequently became the Attorney General of the State of Israel and the President of the Supreme Court, Meir Shamgar, said, well, we can't allow such a situation to happen again. So I'm already going to, in advance, create the legal structure for any situation in which Israel occupies the territory of any of the surrounding countries. And so, as you saw in the film, when Israel entered the West Bank in June 1967, they had all the legal structures ready, and these were based entirely on the international law of belligerent occupation. There was no notion at the time that Israel would have any claim to those territories, that Israel would claim that these territories were its sovereign territories. It was assumed clearly that any territory outside what were then the borders of Israel and become more or less recognized as the political borders of Israel would be regarded as occupied territory, to which the Geneva Convention would apply and the Hague Convention, which I mentioned, would apply. And so you saw in the film that that is what happened immediately after June 1967. But of course, law does not exist in a vacuum. Law is part of the political structure. And the major feature of the Israeli occupation is the clear disparity between the law of occupation, which is formally applicable in the occupied territories, though it's not really applied, and the political attitudes of the government of Israel towards the occupied territories, as that political attitude has developed during the last 54 years. Now, the interesting thing is, in the books that I've written, and I just had a new edition of my book published last year, deals with the attitude of the Supreme Court to petitions relating to the occupied territories. Because soon after 1967, as you saw in the film, a decision was made that Israel would not contest the jurisdiction of the court to deal with petitions by Palestinians resident in the occupied territories challenging acts of the military authorities in the occupied territories. And there have been hundreds, thousands of judgments dealing with all aspects of the occupied territories. Now, the interesting thing is that when the government has to defend its actions before its own Supreme Court, for instance, a Palestinian says, why did you take my land? The government always resorts to the law of belligerent occupation and says, under the law of belligerent occupation, this is entirely legal. For security reasons, under the law of belligerent occupation, it's legal for the military commander to seize land. And then, of course, they make up some kind of argument that the land was needed for security reasons, and the court is generally highly reluctant to question these attitudes of the government. But of course, that is not the attitude of the government on the political level, because the government, most of the governments, especially the governments that have been in power for the last 40 years or more, have said the territories are not really occupied territories. If you look on the site of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, you'll see that the Israeli Foreign Ministry says, no, these territories are not really occupied.
He said it. He said it this week. Bennett said it this week. He said
Yeah.
he was interviewed on CNN, and they called it occupied territories, and he made a point to say they're not occupied territories. They're
Interesting.
disputed territories. That's what he said.
Territories. Well, there's no such thing in international law as disputed territories. But the interesting thing is that when it comes to arguing cases before the Supreme Court, it's the government which argues, wait a second, we can do this because the law of belligerent occupation applies. They took it even further. When the government made the decision to evacuate the settlers from the Gaza Strip, and the settlers themselves challenged the constitutionality of that and said, how can you force us to leave our homes? The government itself said, what do you want? This is occupied territory. In occupied territory, the rule of Israel is temporary. If the government decides to leave, you can't stay there. Bye-bye. So it's very cynical. And so what is left of the law of belligerent occupation? And about 10 years ago, I wrote an article in which I said fundamentally the law of belligerent occupation, instead of being a law which tries to balance between the duty of the occupying power to maintain order, but also with very strong restrictions on what the occupying power can do so as not to change the nature of the territories, the law of belligerent occupation has become a system of controlling the Palestinian population. And the law of occupation is applied to Palestinians. It's not applied to Israelis, except in the case like in Gaza, when they want to take action against the Israelis, and sometimes they fish out the law of belligerent occupation. So now, Misha, I'll go back to your question. So what is the object of the law? Well, theoretically, the object of the law is to avoid a system of chaos on a temporary basis and to allow a military to maintain some kind of control over territory until a peace agreement has been reached and we can restore normality and the people in the territory can have control over their own lives, or their former government can have control over their lives. And that should be the object. But the object of the law in the occupied territories today is different in my mind. The object of the law in the territories today is just to maintain control over the Palestinian population without giving them political rights. And this is the interesting thing. You're going to come up with the question of apartheid very soon. It's inevitable in a case like this. But I'll just open and then I'll end. About 10, 15 years ago, Professor John Dugard, who was at one stage the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the occupied territories, he wrote an article in a leading journal on international law, arguing that the system on the West Bank was a system of apartheid. And the journal asked an Israeli legal scholar who's identified largely with the right in Israel to answer his article. And the only answer she could offer was, no, we can justify everything under the law of occupation. So in other words, the only argument that they can present in order to justify the fact that you're living with a population for 55 years, which is no political rights in the state which controls their lives, is, well, this is a situation of occupation. I'll stop there. I'm very, very much pleased to answer questions or to relate to anything that you like.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Since you bring up the apartheid question, you grew up in South Africa, and I actually wanted to ask you how when you left South Africa, and what was your journey towards Israel and towards this work, and also about the differences between the apartheid legal system and the occupation of the West Bank? Like, what are some of the similarities and differences there because this is a question that people love to argue about. You know, and it came up in the film as well. In the film, there's a very clear point where it's very clear. The judges say very clearly there are two systems of law here: one for Jews and one for non-Jews. Those are the two systems, and that to many people strikes them as well. What's the difference between that? That is apartheid. Isn't that apartheid? So, so I'm curious. I'm curious about that, especially since you have that personal experience there.
Well, first about my personal experience. I left South Africa in my teens. My whole legal education was in Israel. So I didn't have a legal education in South Africa. All my knowledge in South Africa was going to school in South Africa and growing up in South Africa, which was a bad enough experience. And certainly it affected my approach. But I can't really say that I'm in a position as a legal scholar to relate to the fundamental differences, but I will make some general observations. I don't know if I was the first person to relate to the aspects of apartheid in the occupied territories, but I did write an article at the end of the 1980s, pointing out that as soon as you institute different legal rules for different populations according to their ethnic or their national origins, as Misha pointed out, you certainly have an aspect of apartheid. And so as far as the West Bank goes, yes, I think, I'm not sure that it is a system of apartheid, because for a system of apartheid, you need quite a lot more. But you certainly have aspects which are very reminiscent of the apartheid system, in the sense that you have one set of rules for Palestinians and another set of rules for Israelis. Now, ostensibly, the rules applying to Israelis apply not only to Israeli Jews, but to Palestinian Israelis. That is theoretically, but in actual fact, that is not really the case. So you have certain aspects. The only difference is this, that Israel has not formally annexed the occupied territories. It has annexed Jerusalem, but it hasn't annexed the occupied territories. And as far as the international community goes, it still regards the 1949 lines as the political borders of Israel and the occupied territories, and it's judging Israel's actions in the occupied territories under the law of belligerent occupation. So theoretically, what the international community is calling for is for Israel to make a peace deal, which would involve a total Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and handing the territory over to the Palestinians or whoever they choose to place in power. So that is a very great difference, because Israel does not, at least in theory, relate to the whole of the West Bank and Israel as to one political unit, although that is the tendency. And so it's not surprising that as that tendency grows, and as the difference between formal annexation and annexation de facto becomes blurred, you're going to have organizations like Human Rights Watch and like Amnesty International, which look at the whole system and say, not only do you have a system of apartheid on the West Bank, but typifying the whole political and legal system of Israel as a system of apartheid.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it certainly sounds, by the way you're presenting it, like what the government does is it's playing a double game by, on the one hand, using the term occupation when it's convenient and legally beneficial, and on the other hand, denying it and calling it something else whenever it needs to do that and for political purposes. So yeah, Amy asked about the difference. Is there a difference between occupation and belligerent occupation, this term that you've used a few times?
There are different kinds of occupation. There can be, but today when I talk about occupation, I'm talking about the belligerent occupation. In the legal theory books, you'll see that there are different, certain other kinds of occupation, but they're not really relevant in this day and age. The main relevance is to belligerent occupation, which is occupation which is a result of an armed conflict.
Okay. Um, okay, and Amy, your other question, Amy asked about the status of the West Bank and Gaza in before the occupation. That actually relates to a clip that I wanna share and then ask you, David, about. Um, the short answer, Amy, is before 1967, the West Bank was Jordan and Gaza was Egypt, and but before that, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And that comes up in the film with the story of, in the chapter called Dead Lands, which you may remember.
Right.
This thing about Mawat, which just on a personal level, it was striking to me because it turns out that this guy who came up with this brilliant legal, move, this guy Alex Ramati, he's the father of one of my good friends growing up, and I never knew this about him. And it was amazing also to watch him and see that his mannerisms are so similar to his son's, and his whole attitude, his even the way I found him to have a true sweetness. This guy, I had a kind of double experience there because I felt like, oh my goodness, my good friend's father uh, found the legal trick that basically allowed the entire settlement, um, settlement enterprise to take place. Maybe not the entire, but he played a very important part in it. So I just want to describe what I understood he describes, that that moment, and then show the last clip that we see in the film of Alex Ramati, and then ask David a question about it. So here's how I understand what took place. There was a settlement that went up called Elon Shvut. It was one of the very early settlements.
No, Elon Moreh.
Elon Moreh, toda, Elon Moreh, and it was built essentially on Palestinian lands, and it came to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that this is illegal. It's not legal to confiscate lands of Palestinians and then build Jewish settlements, Israeli settlements on that land. That's not a proper legal configuration because because it has nothing to do with security, right? The idea was we need these lands for security purposes, and then once we have them for security purposes, then we're going to build a settlement on it. Yeah. Um, so the court came in and said, no, that's not okay. And then Sharon, who was, I guess, Minister of Defense at the time,
Minister of Agriculture, but he was in charge of settlement.
right? Thank you. He brought in a whole big group of people, different minds of different types, who might have, as he understood that he has to follow the Supreme Court's decision, but he was looking for some way to get over it, basically, to maneuver around it. And so he brought together all these people, and different people said different things. And he really caught on to what this guy, Alex Ramati, said, which was he talked about this, he brought up this idea of Admot Mawat, dead lands, which was an Ottoman law. Yeah, and that's where this connects to what you're asking, Amy, because many of the laws, in effect, even to this day, there are certain Ottoman laws that are still essentially in effect in the occupied territories, yeah, in the West Bank. And so he brings up this Ottoman law that says that if a certain piece of land, and correct me, David, if I'm getting this wrong, I'm sure I'm not getting all the details right. If a certain piece of land is beyond a rooster's crow of a habited place, yeah, of a village or a city or a town, and nobody has worked that land, tilled that land for 3 years, then that land can be called a dead land, meaning it's nobody's land. It's no man's land. And those lands, the government can declare as state lands and build settlements on them. But any other land that belongs to anybody, that is illegal. Yeah, according to the Supreme Court's decision. Yeah. First of all, before we share the clip, David, is that a fair explanation of that process?
It's a fair explanation of what Ramadi said,
Okay.
but I would take what Ramadi said with a greater grain of salt than I asked you to take in judging your introduction to me. He didn't present the position as it developed afterwards. It's slightly more complicated and in a way more pernicious than that.
How so?
Well, you're quite right that according to the law of occupation, the occupying power must respect the law that was in force at the time of occupation. At the time of occupation, the law in force regarding land was still the Ottoman land law. By the way, that was the land law which was in force when I studied at the Hebrew University in the 1960s. It was only on the 1st of January 1970 that the Israeli land law came into effect and did away with the Ottoman land law. Now, the Ottoman land law divides land into 5 categories. The one category is called milk land, in which people can get total private ownership, which was known by a kushan, which is a title deed. But most of the land was another form of land, which is called miri, not muat, but miri. And miri land was in theory owned by the sultan, by the government, but that an individual who worked the land for 10 years and cultivated the 10 land could then get rights in the land, which was more or less accepted as parallel to ownership. In fact, in Israel until 1970, when this was in force, anybody who had title, that kind of title over miri land, was regarded as the owner of the land. Now, what happened after the Len Morer case, in which the court did not say that you can never take private land for building a settlement. They said in each case you have to prove that you have a specific security aim in mind in taking that land. You have the power to take land for security reasons, but you have to show us that there really was a security reason and not a political reason. In 2 previous cases, they'd upheld the same mechanism. After the Elon Morer case, the government passed a resolution, a formal resolution, in which they said in future they would continue with the project of settlement in the occupied territories. They called it Judah and Samaria and Gaza, on what they called lands of the state. Now, this is highly problematical for a number of reasons. The first reason is, well, exactly which state are we talking about? Because Israel is not the state which has sovereignty over the West Bank. And so they were intentionally using a term which is misleading, number one. Number two, there was in force already a law, a military law on the West Bank, which said that there was a special custodian of property who could put his hands on any property which was government property, not state property, but government property. And they put their hands on property which belonged to the Jordanian government, such as government buildings, etc. After the Elon Morer case, following that decision of the cabinet, they decided to put their hands not only on the Moat land that Ramati mentioned in his meeting with Sharon, according to what he says in the film, but on all the Miri land, which is much more important, because Moat land is generally land which is fallow, it cannot be cultivated. But Miri land was land that which was in effect in the hands of many Palestinians. But then they decided if they could show by aerial photographs that this land had not been cultivated agriculturally for 10 years, they could put their hands on the land. Now, and it becomes more complicated. I'm sorry, I'm going to complicate you with legal matters, but these were not mentioned in the film. Okay, so they've put their hands on the land, but what can they do with the land? According to the law of belligerent occupation, this is public land. And public land, the military government is supposed to hold as a trustee for the benefit of the local population. And it's supposed to, it can use what is called the fruits of the land, but it cannot actually change the nature of the land or the capital of the land. To the best of my knowledge, there was never a legal opinion relating to the use that they could make of government land, which they then called state land, which has no basis in law. And they started building settlements. They had a special lawyer in the state attorney's office, Plea Albert, who since died. And her task was to go around and locate land which was not cultivated, and that would be either Muat or generally Miri land, and declare it as state land, and then they would build settlements. Now, the interesting thing is that this ostensibly could be challenged in court, and part of what I show in my book is when it comes to the question of settlements, the legality of settlements, which are illegal under international law for the occupying power to establish settlements for its own citizens in the occupied territory. The court said this is a political question, we're not touching it. We're not saying it's legal, we're not saying it's illegal, we're not going to deal with it. But then a guy came up and said, wait a second, they declared my land to be public land, and they're building a settlement on the land. That's not legal. They then decided, well, it's not really your land under this whole thing that you hadn't cultivated the land for 10 years. You built a house there, but that's not good enough. It's just cultivation. Building a house is not cultivation. And then they said the most amazing thing for the Israeli Supreme Court. The Palestinian does not have the standing to challenge the use made of public land. Now, this was the most cynical use of the notion of standing, because under the way the Israeli law is developed, practically anybody has standing to challenge government actions which are not directed against a specific individual. But the one case in which they decided that you don't have standing is relating to the use made of public land on the West Bank. So the whole way it developed was not the way that Ramati says, Muat land, which is not a large proportion of the land. It was the Miri land, which is the large proportion of the land on the West Bank, which they then said, if it's not cultivated, we can take it. And if we can take it, it belongs to the state, as it were, the state of Israel, and we can settle our people on the land.
Wow. Right. I see why you're saying that's it's quite different to the way he described it. There's a lot of questions. I want to get to the questions, but what I'd like to do is show this very short clip, and then get your reaction to that clip, and then open it up for questions. So Itamar, if you could please just let's watch this short. It's about a minute long. This short clip.
אזרחים ישראלים. רובם חיים ביישובים שהוקמו על קרוב ל1,000,000 דונם שהוכרזו על ידי המפקד הצבאי כאדמות מדינה. מדינת ישראל. עכשיו, במבט לאחור, על ההברקה המשפטית הזו שלך, ההחייאה במרכאות של ההגדרות מחוק הקרקעות העות'מאני, אפשר לומר שמדובר במהלך קטן עם השלכות היסטוריות.
יכול להיות, אפשר להסתכל על זה ככה, אבל לומר, הייתי שותף למהלך היסטורי באיזושהי צורה.
והיום, כמו שאתה מנתח את המצב, אתה חושב שהמהלך היה נכון?
אני לא חושב שלמישהו יש תשובה לשאלה הזאת. אני חושב שרק בהסתכלות היסטורית יראו אם זה היה מהלך נכון או לא. אף אחד לא יודע מה יצא מכל הסיפור הזה.
מתי יעשו אותה?
מתי?
יעשו אותה, מתי התבוננו על זה באופן היסטורי?
אני לא יודע, זה בטח לא בשנה הבאה, זה בעוד הרבה שנים.
הקיום של 500,000 אזרחים ישראלים, מתנחלים.
Thanks. Thank you, Itamar. So, David, my question to you is, several of these judges, several of them were confronted in this film with the results of their work. And from what I could tell, none of them are really able to confront, the reality of what they've created, um, including Shamgar at the end, who answers another question there about why the court never addressed taking Israeli citizens and putting them into the territories. But this was the moment that really struck out to me. That really stood out, because he doesn't he's able to say, Ramati is able to say, this action that I took has perhaps had has had an effect, but he's certainly not able to say it had a negative effect or a positive effect, but definitely not a negative effect. And I just want to get your reaction to that piece of it.
It's a very difficult question, because it's a question which is not only relevant to the military lawyers who were part and parcel and still are part and parcel of occupation. The same question you could ask to those lawyers in the American administration who were party to the torture policies and Guantanamo. And what we find is that in order to address the questions that Ramati asks, there's no legal answer to those questions. You have to have a political answer or a moral answer or a philosophical answer. And what lawyers who are technicians and are just serving their boss and will do whatever the boss wants, and I'm sorry to say we have a lot of very difficult historical examples of that, is that they try to avoid as far as possible the real questions which every lawyer should first and foremost ask himself or herself. I'll give you another example. There was one lawyer, and I won't mention his name, but he's, from the legal point of view, he's a very good lawyer, and he was the head of a major military legal department in the army for many, many years. And he was the person who provided legal justification for some of the most pernicious acts of the military government, including demolition of houses and deportations, etc. And we had a discussion around the film. After Ranan came out with the film, and I, as Misha said, I was involved to some extent in the film, and advising Ranan when he prepared the first version of the film. And I suggested we have a number of symposia at the Hebrew University discussing parts of the film. And in one of those, we invited this lawyer who is no longer in the army. This must have been about 10 years ago. And the amazing thing that he said, which has struck me to this day, is that he never thought about the kind of questions that you posed. He never thought about them. Now, how can a person say to the army, it's legal to destroy the home of a whole family because of the act of a son of the family, which they didn't know about and they had no connection with, without asking himself these kind of questions? But that is the way that lawyers escape from these things, and that is the big problem. And that is our kind of failure as legal educators. That if we can educate us, I've been teaching law for 55 years, and if we educate our students to go out and be lawyers who don't ask these questions, then we failed. And unfortunately, I can say that to this day, lawyers are being educated in many places in the world who will not ask these questions, and that's what you have.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Let's turn to some questions. There are some questions and comments that came up in the chat, or if people have questions that you can raise your hand. And here, Adam. Let's start with Adam, and then we'll get to some of the ones in the chat. We can't hear you, Adam. Adam, we can't hear you.
I know very little about Israeli law, and I don't know really that much about American law, except that I can say in my lifetime and previous to my lifetime, there are many things the American Supreme Court has done, whether it's the internment of Japanese Americans, approving that, or removal of Native Americans on their land, someone referred to here, Dred Scott decision about slavery, or the permission of President Trump to be able to instill a Muslim ban blocking people from certain countries, that by my standards, and I think by most standards, are clearly immoral and clearly wrong. Yet they were determined to be legal. And the distinction between what's legal and what's right is not, again, I'm not coming from a legal point of view. I'm just coming from a human being point of view. The challenge always seems to be to how to get the law to do what it is you'd like it to do, or how to get to stand up as a legal issue, whether or not it's right or wrong. And I do tend to think these things tend to play out over time and get resolved over time, hopefully. And, you know, I don't know if the big moral shortcoming in this period of time that was being spoken of was the legal system that was allowed to be set up in order to justify these things, or the actions themselves. But hopefully this will look different 10, 20 years from now than it does now. This is already 10 years ago from when it happened. So I can't really speak to how the law or looking upon these things has changed in Israel, because I think it's a very complicated issue. And it's the only other thing I kept on thinking when I was watching the film is, as you know, there was like a lot of very sophisticated green screen, whereas these guys were being interviewed behind a blank background, just like on the TV news or the weather, which is green, so that later they can put in that footage. And I think it's important to know that the people who were being interviewed, because the footage, the archival footage, which I, as an American, was not that familiar with, was really stunning, of occupation and of treatment of individuals. And the people who were being interviewed did not know what was behind them. They just knew they were in front of a blank wall. So the connection between what they were saying and how it's being commented upon by the selection of material by the filmmaker was something that was beyond them. They were speaking in a blank space and they were asking questions. And I couldn't agree more that where the filmmakers kept on pointing out, because there was a very big element in this movie, that every film is editorial, but the editorial selections here were extremely individual, distinct, and impacting the screening and experience of the movie. So just two thoughts. I'm not sure it's really a question.
Thanks, Adam. Anybody else want to ask, or even people who put it into the chat who want to kind of ask their question out loud? Cincy?
I was curious, you know, I thought, as I put in the chat, that this whole notion of dead land, I am an attorney, and it was brilliant. I mean, you know, there's a moment in there where, you know, coming up with something like that was brilliant, even though it had such draconian impact. But what I noticed was that they were blowing up what appeared to be blowing up land after that decision. And I just wondered if you knew, was that to make it as if it was uncultivated, you know, to sort of bring it back to the very beginning so it could be considered, you know, state land or government land, you know, government land?
No, to the best of my knowledge, that was not the policy. They didn't need to do that. They had enough land which they could lay their hands on, which they could claim had been cultivated for 10 years, or even if a person had cultivated for 10 years, if for 3 years they don't cultivate the land, it, as it were, returns to the Sultan. So they didn't need to do that, but they had all kinds of other mechanisms. And it's not only the Maryland, there were various mechanisms. For instance, one of the things is to declare land to be land that is needed for military training areas, and then it's closed to Palestinians. Another one is to declare land to be a nature reserve, and therefore it's not allowed to build in that kind of land. So they've used every kind of legal mechanism that they can. And the worrying thing about it is that they do want a facade of legality. Now you have to say, what is your choice? Because everything, they go through the lawyers. Everything is not decided by the military commander. He sends it off to the legal branch and they come up with some kind of way, like Ramati saying the Muwato in the Ministry of Justice saying we can declare all the Murray land to be state land. And they come up with all legal mechanisms. Now, of course, it's all serving the political purposes of the government of Israel, and it's a total perversion of what occupation is supposed to be about.
I'm looking here at Joni's. Joni wrote that there are parallels between the kind of injustices committed against indigenous populations all over the world. And it's Joni, if I'm understanding your question correctly, it sounds like you're asking, like, is this kind of par for the course around the world, or is this or is this a unique type of oppression of an indigenous population?
Actually, let me just try to elucidate a little bit. It's so broad in my mind, but it just seems like there is, we used to call it second world and first world peoples, right? And to me, it connects to that, people who kind of never really had any kind of legal status. They're nomadic or, hunter-gatherer situations. And that it's kind of it seems in a weird sort of way, there's an anthropological basis almost for this kind of behavior. And I don't understand what that is, but I just feel that there's something to that all these peoples, all these unrepresented nomadic peoples fall into this kind of category where they are easily oppressed by more quote developed societies. Is that like a really broad, wacky assumption, or is there any kind of like scientific basis or legal basis? Or I think I've said no.
Well, I do accept that there's a clash here between what you would call, if we want to call it first world and second world. I don't think that the indigenous kind of parallel is very relevant, because contrary to what sometimes the Zionists want to put across, the Palestinians were not an indigenous population when Israel started settling in the 19th century. They had institutions. They were largely an agricultural society, but that is very different from an indigenous society. And they had political institutions. I sat in Geneva for many years looking through the files of what happened between the walls and the question of the mandate. And at the time, of course, the Zionist argument is there was no such thing as a Palestinian people. But if you examine the files there was a special mandates commission which was dealing with petitions challenging acts of the British mandatory authorities. And you see that there were dozens of petitions that were presented by Palestinian organizations, the Palestinian Congress, etc., arguing against the legality of actions carried out by the British mandate. So you did have a society which was largely an agricultural society. It didn't have any central institutions, but they had local councils, and they were organized, and from not organized enough, but that is not. Now, the Bedouin, I don't know, but David, Misha's father, is probably much better qualified to answer this than I am. Maybe when you come down to some of the Bedouin, you would have a greater parallel to indigenous people, but the vast majority of Palestinians were living in towns. There were large towns, Hebron and Ramleh and Lod. And Israel, Yafo was a thriving port. Not to mention the number of Arabs who were living in Haifa and who were living in Jenin and who were living in Bethlehem. So I don't think the parallel with the indigenous is a correct parallel, but I do think that you do have the question of a sophisticated, developed society coming and taking advantage of a society which was left of it, especially when it comes to land rights. And this is where many societies have done that, but they did it to the indigenous. If you take what the Canadians and the Australians did, this is very much connected to the right of the Bedouin, because very often the land rights of Palestinians were communal rights. For instance, if you take grazing grounds, the grazing grounds were grounds of specific communities. They could be grounds which were regarded as the grazing meadows of specific villages. So they were not registered in the name of that village, but everybody recognized that this is the land of that village, or the same thing with the Bedouin in the Negev. But of course, then comes the advanced society, which says we have a different concept of private ownership. And if it's not registered in the name of some individual, then it obviously belongs to the state. And if it belongs to the state of Israel is going to take it over. So there are parallels, but I don't think it's complete.
Thank you. It just kind of begs the question for me, just to pursue this a little more. So like, basically capitalism is a big engine behind these kinds of operations. I'm asking.
Well, you know, when I look at what the socialist, so-called socialist regimes did when it comes to property, and then I'm not so sure that you can lay everything in the hands of capitalism, although a lot you can today. But ostensibly, the Israeli system was to a large extent a socialist system, and the socialists were very, very good at laying their hands on private land. Let's face it, they didn't want to recognize even the notion of the private property, or certainly not private ownership of the means of production. So,
thank you.
Anybody else want to put a question out to David, or say something, say comment?
Can I just add one little thing, if I may? I know this is going to be really out there, but before we came here, I read the Torah. I went back to Jacob, and you know, it's just like it's like, where's God in all this? You know, I mean, that's sort of, you know, I mean, we got the legal, but you know, I've always heard the Torah is like the basis of law. You know, it's like that was, you know, we laid down the law in the Torah. It's laid down. So, you know, that's just a comment I was like brewing up in me that I, you know, had to say, like, where, you know, it's like, and human rights and security and human rights, but it's like, you would just see, even though with the rule of law, that the Palestinians are not being treated as humans, you know, and this is just so painful. You know, I cried during this film. I don't know how many of you did, but it brought me to tears, which is why it's so powerful.
David, I was actually going to ask you something along a similar line. I was going to the Talmud rather than to the Torah, but same. Potatoes. I was going to ask you if there's because I don't know if this is still the case, but when I was younger, Israeli lawyers are trained in certain parts to deal with the Talmud. There's some pieces of the legal education that has to do with the Talmud, and I was going to ask if there's a piece of it, and I know you know it well. Is there a piece of the Talmud or the Torah or the tradition that is a kind of guide for you in your?
Yes, absolutely. There's one guide for me, and that is the famous saying of Hillel HaZaken. As you know, the famous story in the Talmud, where a non-Jew comes to Hillel HaZaken and he says, teach me the Torah on one foot, while I'm standing on one foot. And his reply is, don't do to anybody else what is hateful for yourself. That is the whole Torah. The rest is just an explanation. Go out and learn. Now, I think of this a great deal because the questions that you ask are questions that probably bother me more than anything else, because I'm fairly observant. I'm Shabbat observant, Kashrut observant. I used to go to the Bet Knesset every day, which I no longer do. I think I originally met your father, Misha, at a Bet Knesset at Yedidia. And yet I've become totally alienated because the way the Torah is being used in this day and age is contrary to everything that I value in my life. And it has caused, in my mind, a total defamation of the Torah and a defamation of the religion as I understand it. If I go back to what you asked, and Cynthia is your name? Or, yeah. If I go back to what you asked, yeah, I think that when you and I will speak about the Torah, we probably have the same values. But unfortunately, when you look at those who are arguing in the name of Torah, ostensibly in Israel, they're arguing for exactly the opposite. The most fascist, nationalistic, ethnocentric people in Israel today are ostensibly arguing on behalf of the Torah. Now, this brings me back to Adam's remark. And Adam, I think we have a major question here. Because we had the Yom HaShoah last week, and I'm not a person who makes comparisons. I mean, as far as however critical I am of what has happened in Israel in general and in the occupied territories, Israel is certainly not the worst regime in the world, very far from it. It's probably not the worst regime in the immediate Middle East even. But that is not the point. One of the questions which arose among lawyers after the Nazi period was, how do we explain the action of German lawyers? And the German lawyers played a very, very pernicious role in the whole of the Nazi regime. Many of the worst Nazis were doctors of law. And there's a famous book by Miller called Hitler's Justice, in which you see how the courts related. And one of the arguments at the really beginning was similar to the argument that I made and that Adam made to a certain extent in his comments earlier, that they had a positivistic view of the law. And therefore, they just applied the law without thinking of the implications. But if they would have thought of the implications, they would have decided otherwise. That is not the theory today. The theory today is exactly the opposite. They perverted the law for the sake of ideology. The problem was, of course, that their ideology was the Nazi ideology. And that in many cases, where if they would have applied the law very, very strictly, they could have, say, acquitted people in the name of Nazi ideology, they convicted them. Now, Bisha asked me about South Africa. It's very, very interesting. Some of the judges in South Africa who wanted to fight the apartheid regime knew that the only way to fight it was to take a positivist approach and to interpret the law very, very strictly, not to pretend in any way that they were trying to advance humanistic values, but to say, that is what the law says. What can we do about it? You're wrong. You can't take this guy's land. So it washes both ways. And you can see that with the American Supreme Court, as Adam knows as well as I do. Whether we like what the Supreme Court has done very much depends on what philosophy we are going to take. When the Supreme Court decided in the Lochner area that laws restricting the hours of work in laundries, for instance, a famous case, were unconstitutional, they were being a very, very activistic court, but they were being activistic in the name of values which you and I don't share. And when the court decided and Roe weighed the other way, if you agree with it, it's because we subscribe to those values. So this creates a very, very difficult problem because there's no such thing as one Torah. There's the Torah of David Shulman and David Kretzmer and Misha Shulman. and we believe entirely in our Torah, but unfortunately, the Torah of Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir is a totally different Torah, which I abhor. So now to call on greater relation to the Torah, that would be fine if they're going to take my interpretation. But unfortunately, if I take a guess, they're going to do the exact opposite. So what I want to do is to take the Torah entirely out of Israeli politics. I don't want it to have anything to do with it because I'm not going to have control of what interpretation they're going to use. And that is the problem.
Thank you. My Abba has a question.
David, first of all, I wanted to thank you for your eloquence. And I have a question for you. Before I ask it, I just want to say I'm very remote from the legal world. And all I can say is that I have a lot of experience, too much experience in the territories of what could only be defined, at least in my world, as acts of horrific cruelty and injustice on a daily, actually on an hourly basis. But since people, human beings, seem to have a need to rationalize the cruel and terrible things they do to one another, and the law is one domain where that kind of rationalization seems to take place, I want to ask you if you think the Israeli Supreme Court, if you look at the last 55 years as a whole, with reference to the, let's say, the settlement project or to various facets of life in the occupation, if you think that the record of the Supreme Court is a record of cowardice and abject moral failure, was it possible for them to act otherwise within the cultural and social and political setting in which they were living? What do you think?
Answer, I'm afraid to advertise my book, but the answer is in the new edition of my book called The Occupation of Justice, the Supreme Court of Israel and the Occupied Territories. And this is the second edition, which was published exactly a year ago. And this is the very question that I ask. Now, let me tell you what my conclusions were, and this is very much relevant to David's question, but then I want to say something more. My conclusion in this book is that the court has legitimized all the policies and practices of the Israeli government in the occupied territories, even when there are very, very cogent legal reasons to believe that these policies or practices are not consistent with international law. However, the Supreme Court has, on many occasions, offered remedies to individuals which they would never have received if the Supreme Court had not exercised jurisdiction over the occupied territories. In many cases, the remedy is provided not by a judgment of the court, but by the mere submission of a petition to the court, in which the court then pressures the authorities to modify their standard to reach some kind of deal with the petitioners, the Palestinian petitioners. So you have many, many such cases. In fact, I would say that research shows that into 30% or more of the cases in which Palestinians do submit petitions to the Supreme Court, they receive some kind of full or partial remedy, not necessarily because the court is going to rule in their favor. What the court has chosen to do is, rather than to question the legality of the policies and practices, is to place the emphasis on the way those policies and practices are implemented. And then to use notions such as unreasonableness or proportionality to say, well, in this case, we're not questioning your policy, but you've been a bit hard-handed in the way you've done in this situation is not reasonable or it's not proportionate. So that is a general framework of what the Supreme Court has done. And you saw the last part of the book of Justice, when Justice Shamgar attacked what I said. Now, it was slightly misrepresented because in the first edition of the book, I was very critical of the Supreme Court. But then I asked the question at the end, but what would have happened if the court from the very beginning would have said, you know what, I don't have any jurisdiction over the occupied territory. It's not part of Israeli territory. It's got nothing to do with us. And my answer was that it's clear that in the short or medium term, there would have been more arbitrariness because in many cases, the authorities have avoided doing things because they know that they can't stand up in court. But on the other hand, I posed the question. I never took a stand. I said, but is it possible? And I was a bit naive. This was just at the time of the Oslo Accords. And I said, well, it's possible that if the Supreme Court hadn't exercised jurisdiction, the eyes of the Israeli elites to what the occupation was about would have been opened earlier, and they would have called for an end to the occupation before the Intifada, which brought about the changes that led to Oslo. I no longer believe that because I don't have much faith in the Israeli elites anymore. So that's not the point. But the point is this, that you have to look at what courts are, and people have exaggerated expectations of courts anywhere. Courts are political institutions, political with a small p. They're not party political. They don't ostensibly take part in the general political process, but they are branches of government of a specific state. The American Supreme Court is a Supreme Court of the United States. It's not an international court. The Israeli Supreme Court is the Supreme Court of Israel. And when it comes down to it, they are going to take the stand fundamentally on major issues, which is the stand taken by the vast majority of the public and of the government in Israel. And now you've also got to understand that the Supreme Court today is under tremendous attack. There is no other institution of government except now with the Prime Minister, the present government. But up to the present government, there was no institution of government which was under more attack than the Supreme Court in an attempt to delegitimize the very existence of the court. The Prime Minister now is Bennett. But he ran for the elections in one of the elections. I don't even remember which number. We had 4 elections over the last year. And what was his kind of theme for the elections? Take the authority from the court and return it to the people. You remember that. The court is under attack the whole time. Every time the court issues a judgment, which is slightly critical of the government as far as state and religion, or as far as the occupied territories, you're going to say, this is a court that is a court of merits, the so-called left-wing party of the government, and this is a court of... So the court is operating in this environment. It has to tread very, very carefully. Now, what did the court do? The one thing that people are very critical of is the court avoided the question of the legality of the settlements, which is, as David very well knows, it's the major issue. That is the issue. Everything revolves around the taking of land and settlements, whether they lawful under Israeli law, unlawful under Israeli law, but that is the fundamental issue in the occupied territories. The insatiable, I would say, appetite to put hands on more and more land and settle more and more people there. And the Supreme Court said, we're not going to rule whether it's lawful or not lawful. Now, David, I ask you this question. I'm going to return it to you. Assume the Supreme Court in 1979 had said, sorry, it's not legal to establish settlements in the occupied territory. Do you think that would have changed the policy of the government? No, it would not. There's a limit to what courts would have done. They couldn't have done it. They realized it. They realized that this was something in which they could have no effect. It was deep. It was the Begin government. It had come to power on the basis of its ideology of settling Jews in the whole of the historic land of Israel. No court could have stopped this. And I don't know what the government would have done. There were, at the time of the Elon Morekas, which Misha mentioned earlier, in which they just decided that one settlement was illegal. There are already threats to pass legislation removing the jurisdiction of the court to deal with cases of the occupied territories. We saw now that when the court ruled that they had to evacuate some of the so-called unlawful outposts, they passed a law in the Knesset trying to regularize all of them. Now the Supreme Court knocked that down, but on constitutional grounds, not on the grounds of international. So however critical I am, and if you read my book, you'll see that I'm extremely critical of a lot of what the court has done. And in many cases, for instance, the case of demolition of houses, they could have decided otherwise. They could have decided from the very beginning, no punitive demolition of houses, and they would have stopped it, and nothing would have happened. And they could have decided no deportations, they could have done that. But when it comes down to the major issues of settlements, they realized that this was too big an issue for them. The only thing they could do was to destroy the court. And they realized this. So now you've got to realize that people have exaggerated expectations from courts. They think that courts are some kind of independent issue. Now, the main kind of distinction that I make in my book, and that I think that most Israeli lawyers fail in making this distinction, is distinction between independence and neutrality. Israeli courts are Israeli judges are independent. They are appointed to the mandatory retirement age of 70. There's no way that the government can fire a judge. A judge can only be fired by a judgment of his own peers. So they can't change their salaries. The judges are independent, but they're not neutral. They're Israelis, and they're dealing with a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. They can't be neutral in such a situation like that. Clearly, their perception is the perception of the Israeli establishment. It's not ever going to be otherwise, and you can't expect it to be otherwise. So that is my answer to you. Yes, I would have hoped that the court would have done better. And on many other cases, I certainly think that it should have done better. But if I look at the large picture, if you would have asked me in advance 54 years ago, what do I think it will be like in 54 years? I'm not sure that I would have expected to be much different from what it is. That's what courts are about. Look at the American court today. What are you going to expect from the American court today? What happened in the American court when Guantanamo was set up? For years, they wouldn't even rule it. They wouldn't even decide whether you have a habeas corpus until things settled down. Then they were prepared to deal with it. It may sound depressing, but that's the situation.
Well, yes and no. Yeah, I mean it's certainly depressing, but it's also it's also simply reality.
Yeah.
You know, we're looking at what is the legal system, and in that sense, the question that I asked you first about the purpose of the law and whether there's a difference between what we get the legal system here and the legal system in the West Bank. Well, no. It sounds like the answer is ultimately no. We're out of time, and I'd like to thank you so much, David, for being with us today and for leading us through the complexities of this in such a nuanced and clear-headed way. It's really wonderful to hear you speak about all of this. And the one thing I'd like to bring us back to is what we chanced upon at the beginning, which is this question that Adam brought up, not on purpose, I think, but this question of hope. And I don't know exactly where to put that hope. And certainly reality is very, very powerful. It's very, very powerful. But maybe the hope lies in something like this, or maybe that's not hope. But let me give it a shot here. You said before that there's our Torah and there's Ben Gvir's Torah and the Torah of those folks, and that you spoke about them as if they're different Torahs. But my rabbi, who's here today, Jim Ponette, he taught me that that's actually not true. That there's that these Torahs are different Torahs, but that they all exist within us. All of these different pieces, and maybe something of maybe not hope, but maybe peace. Maybe there's a peace to be made, not with what's happening, and not with the direction things to be going. Those are things I don't think we are to make peace with. But perhaps there's a peace to be made with the internal struggle that we each have around these questions, with with our national struggle to accept that it's a struggle, and to commit ourselves to the aspect of Torah, the view of Torah, the heart of Torah that we see and feel and love. So I'll leave us with that today, and wish you all a nice Sunday, and Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach, or Nakba Atzuva, whichever you mark. And I'll remind you also that we have two more events coming up this week. One is on Tuesday, is the joint Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Day ceremony. That's hope right there. That's hope. The biggest Israeli-Palestinian peace initiative in history. Last year, 300,000 people were on it online live, and another 700,000 watched it after. So 1 million people got together to work on hope. That's on Tuesday at 1:30, and you should have gotten the emails. But it's an extraordinary event, and I hope you guys can log on for some of it at least. And then on Friday, we have this extraordinary Shabbat about rest and bodily autonomy, and an organization called Black Women's Blueprint. And it's going to be a very beautiful and special Shabbat, Kabbalat Shabbat, that Maya and Erica and I thought I saw some. I thought I saw Sylvia here too. There's a few women from the community who got together to put this beautiful event together. That's going to be political, and it's going to be healing, and it's going to be faith-based, and there are truly some extraordinary people who are going to be in this event. There's actually Maya can tell you better, but there's this midwife, an activist midwife, who's going to be speaking with Maya during the event, and there's going to be these women from this incredible organization, Black Women's Blueprint, and there's going to be another young woman from Boston speaking, describing her radical notion of Shemitah, the seventh year, in which we are instructed to let the land grow fallow. Whatever the land brings, we can take, and whatever, and we're not allowed to squeeze anything else out of it. There will be some music, and Judy Williams is here, who's going to be singing there. So that's Friday night, and if you can make it, that's going to be very special. It's at First Presbyterian Church or on Zoom. And finally, on Shabbat morning, there's going to be our first, as far as I know, ever Shabbat morning service, which is going to be a bat mitzvah of Naomi, and it's kind of the first time that the community is gathering as a community to celebrate one of the young members becoming a bat mitzvah. So that'll be Saturday morning at the 14th Street Y. These are the events we got coming up, and then there's more Kumah Festival events, and I hope to see you all at some of them. And again, deep and a deep thank you to you, David, for this morning. Toda rabba.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and all the best to all of you.
Toda. Thank you.
Bye.
Toda Rabbah for this.
Ken.